Hi, everyone. Welcome to Crap Politics. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
I'm Andrew Percy.
And this week we have Sam Coates. Sam is the deputy political editor of Sky News. He's host of one of my favorite podcasts, Politics at Sam and Anne's, which he co-hosts with Politicals and McElvoy. I really enjoy listening to Sam's takes on all things UK politics. So when I need to get caught up, he's one of my go-to resources and sources. So Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the kind words. That's very, very kind. Not many people should have to listen to me at 6 a.m., which is when we record our podcast, but that's what we do.
Thankfully, the time zone difference for me in Vancouver means it's not that early for me. Although it is awesome to wake up and have that kind of those hot takes so early. It's been a heck of a week, though, hasn't it? Should we start with Iran? Just given, I feel it's impossible for us to do a politics show without even at least touching on the subject. You had an interesting take over the weekend. You had a perspective on sort of 4 things that Starmer would have to keep in mind before he would have to engage in the conflict. Would love for you to share that with our listeners.
Well, look, I think in the end what's happened is that the US bombing of Iran has been very clarifying in terms of UK foreign policy, as much because of what we didn't do as what we did. And you're right, there's been this massive global moment. Donald Trump likes to turn it into a soap opera, and the soap opera it has been for the last 72 hours, perhaps a little bit more. But throughout it, Britain's been trying to walk this tightrope, and it's a tightrope that has chosen to follow, partly because of domestic political pressures, partly because of worries about international law. And it's told us a lot about the priorities of the Prime Minister. And essentially, it looks like this. When Donald Trump decided to launch those bunker buster bombs on the sites in Iran, Britain decided that it wasn't going to come out and back the means, but it was going to back the ends. Now, what that meant in practice is that public statements from the Prime Minister down, essentially endorsed any attempt to stop, it endorsed the view that Iran should not have nuclear weapons and should not get nuclear weapons, but it did not explicitly agree with the use of military force, as the US and previously Israel had done to try and stop them doing that. And so we learned quite a lot in that positioning. We learned that effectively, one of the big barriers is that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, listens quite intently to those who pronounce on international law, which in the UK system is the Attorney General, is an individual called Lord Hermer. And we believe Lord Hermer's advice was, look, it would not be legal to join in the US in their conflict against Iran because there is not an imminent threat to an ally. And there is not an imminent threat to an ally because we do not share the US assessment that Iran is on the cusp, or was on the cusp, of getting nuclear weapons. We think they may have had intent, but we don't think they're quite as advanced than that. The fact that Keir Starmer landed in that position tells us that he is prepared to break with the US president in a way that, in the thousands, you wouldn't have seen Tony Blair do with George Bush. You wouldn't really have seen Gordon Brown do, actually, when he became Prime Minister, although he made slightly different noises when he was Chancellor with George Bush. And, successive British Prime Ministers have hugged the Americans close. It tells us that Keir Starmer's kind of balance of view is to escalate the importance of international law. If you remember back in the early 2000s, Tony Blair was confronted by legal advice from his Attorney General over the Iraq War. That was a guy called Lord Goldsmith. Lord Goldsmith also raised concerns about the legality of potential military action. Tony Blair pressed ahead. So the legal advice from a chief legal advisor, in this case the Attorney General, is not binding on a Prime Minister, and Prime Ministers have done different things. And in the end, Keir Starmer showed himself to be fundamentally different to Tony Blair and those instincts. And the next thing it told us is that all the way through this last few days, we have seen really it appear like Keir Starmer isn't able to effectively read Donald Trump, and also clearly has only limited influence over him. A week ago today, we're recording this on Tuesday, a week ago, so exactly 7 days ago, my colleague Beth Rigby did an interview with Keir Starmer. In that interview, Donald Trump had just left Keir Starmer to fly home to the US from Canada, from the Rockies, and Keir Starmer pronounced that there wasn't any chance that Donald Trump was about to bomb Iran. At exactly the same time, Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, the new German Chancellor, was giving interviews in German saying, we think that Donald Trump is about to bomb Iran. So it appears that the British Prime Minister misread the situation, and then when later in the week he was appealing to Donald Trump not to do what he ended up doing, it appears that he was ignored. And then there is a theory that I have, which is that in the end the US never asked that the Diego Garcia base, that is an American base on UK territory, ultimately owned by Mauritius, be used because they knew that we would probably likely refuse and that we would prioritise international law. And I think all of these things point to a breach between the UK and the US, which is more extreme than at any point that I can remember.
I mean, that's really interesting because, I mean, well, first of all, what's the point of having a base if you can't use it? Was the question, I think, was the question Thatcher used to pose when criticised for allowing America to use British bases in the UK to bomb Libya, which is what's the point of having a base if you have to ask the host country when you want to use it, which is an interesting one. But I mean, how much of it really is the international law element and how much of it is just internal Labour Party management? Because, the thing that concerns me is that how are we in a position where our position on international law and on something such as significant as this is being motivated much more by party management or indeed the concerns they have around parts of the Labour voter coalition?
I mean, look, you are 100% right. Legal advice is advice, right? And as I say, previous prime ministers have found ways around legal advice, got them to redo the legal advice, change the question that they asked the lawyer. Just because Lord Homer says something doesn't necessarily mean that it happened. Lord Homer is not the prime minister, although some in the government might think that he has almost that amount of influence. The political choice, the governing choice, is the one made by the prime minister, and he has weighed up various things. And I think that the decision not to side with Israel and the United States was a conscious political choice that he will have taken looking at his voter coalition, his internal party coalition, as well as the legal advice, and concluded that, whether it was politics or whether it was morality or whether it was justice, those things took him to the conclusion that he did. Nobody's saying the lawyer makes the decision.
It just, the whole thing is just, it's been such a different positioning from where we would have been were Rishi Sunak's still Prime Minister. I mean, the fact that we've even apparently refused to stop some of these drones and these ballistic missiles coming over is such a departure from where we were under Rishi and under the last government. So, but although at the same time you've had the government outlawing Palestine action in the same week, right, which has presumably caused some problems within some of that same voter coalition.
Look, to play devil's advocate on your first point, if Keir Starmer had authorised the use of Diego Garcia, if ministers were authorised to go out and say we thought that what America did in Iran was right and just, then there would be a round that way round, right? So we're in a situation where there's going to be a fuss in either direction. And if you're being kind of blunt about it, maybe this is the path to a smaller fuss than you'd get if you'd gone down the path where we'd actively taken part and maybe even were suffering some reprisals, right? I'm sure that there is Iranian offensive capability that could get at a British defensive position, right? So there is that calculation to be had. I'm not saying anything is right or wrong. I am simply saying they picked up a path that they thought took them to a better place, and it is a path that is different to what you would expect Rishi Sunak to say. Although I strongly suspect Rishi Sunak would have agonised over it. I don't think he would have found it particularly straightforward. The issue that Britain has is again, we put ourselves on this tightrope. We always want our cake and eat it, and that is true of the wider position on Israel. That is true on how we are approaching our messaging to the region, and the sort of looking two ways approach that has characterised the last 70 years of UK foreign policy. It's sort of just what we do, and the trade-off is less clarity, more ambiguity, and hopefully more people coming to our aid when we need to. The one question mark I've got is we are in very, very different circumstances because of the very individual nature of the US president, and whether or not there might be specific blowback because of the position that we've taken or not. I've no idea whether there's going to be a bit of that. In the end, Keir Starmer was in the middle. He would have had Lord Mandelson on one side, probably pushing the Trump case. He would have had Lord Homer on the other, and he's gone a bit closer to Homer than to Mandelson. The question is, can Mandelson mop up now and make sure there's not too much impact on the UK-US relationship at a top level?
Yeah, there was a piece in one of the papers, I think it was the Times or maybe the Telegraph, I can't remember, saying that the only other country that was actually warned of the attack was the UK, and that Starmer rang up an hour before the bomb started falling. And apart from Israel, the only country that was informed of it was the UK, which would suggest that there isn't a long-term damage there. But I just wonder if this has any impact on the trade agreement, deal, whatever you want to call it, or the broader relationship. But then does Donald Trump care? Because one day to the next, he seems to forget and remember different things at different times. So who knows, right?
I mean, the principal enemy at the moment seems to be the media, propagators of fake news.
Well, I used to do that all the time, Sam, didn't I?
You did, and that's why you're having me on your podcast, because you believed what you said and took a principled stand. So I think that you're right, he's capricious. The commencement date for the trade agreement that was signed last month by Donald Trump and Keir Starmer, I think he's like in the next couple of days. And so Donald Trump would have to decide to blow up in a big style the agreement with the only country he struck an agreement with. There's political gain from him having a kind of bestie on the world stage when it comes to trade, so he can sort of play others off against each other and say, look, there is a path to righteousness. I think there's jeopardy in ripping up our agreement. Maybe that'll come in the next 3, 4, 5 days before the end of June, but I'm not hearing anything that suggests that's the case. Let's wait and see what the Sunday papers say.
Okay, right. So we've sorted out the Middle East and the Iranian issue. That's all resolved. I want to get on to domestic stuff then, because this is what's most interesting. And I think a lot of our listeners who aren't from the UK also find this interesting, because we've got this situation at the moment where both of the traditional main parties seem to be in a really, really challenged position, particularly from Reform. And we'll come on to that in a moment. But given the Labour Party are in government, it all looks like a bit of a mess at the moment. There's rebellions brewing on everything. Backbenchers seem very restless. Presumably a lot of them are looking at their seats and thinking, if they look at the polls at the moment with Reform, they're only here for one term. So what's going on at the moment then, internal Labour politics, particularly this issue around welfare, and which does also lead into some of the things Reform have been saying at the moment, and Nigel Farage?
Well, Andrew, if I'm being honest, there is an awful lot of bedwetting. Wet, all over the place. Now, let me just, because some of your listeners are in Washington, some of them are in Canada, let me just sort of dial back a little bit. Keir Starmer won a landslide victory last year at the start of July. So we're just about to come up to the first anniversary of that. He has what seems like an impregnable majority in the House of Commons. He has a majority of 165. That's second only, really, to what Tony Blair got in 1997, 2001. Took kind of like well over a decade for Tony Blair to lose a vote. Keir Starmer sort of sat like bestride the entire edifice of British politics in such a commanding position, with the principal opponent, the Conservative Party, knocked for six, and veterans such as yourself scattered to the winds. Although of course you stood down and
just
ducked
remember
the fight rather than you ducked the fight rather than lost. That's the backdrop. Absolutely commanding position. But the problem is his government has got stuck, and it's got stuck in quite a big way. And it inherited a mess. The Conservatives, no doubt about it, left behind public finances in a dreadful state, public services in an absolute mess. Really, really were kind of,
Lies.
It was you're not even trying very hard to disagree with me. And I think it was like in the last sort of Tory government, it was like jimmying a car at the end of its life. They were just pouring whatever they could in the engine to keep it going, emptying budgets they shouldn't have done, and all the rest of it. So they inherited a horrible mess, but they haven't done a very good job of trying to sort it out. And through a combination of naivety and short-termism and just political mishandling, two things have happened. First of all, they are in a really difficult situation when it comes to the public finances. The UK government sits upon a massive debt pile, which is again the inheritance of the Conservative Party, and so it's not got the most secure position in the markets, and it has borrowed a lot and spent a lot. So the public finances are pushed up against some self-imposed fiscal rules, and there are a lot of pressures on the government crying out for yet more spending and yet more borrowing, but the government isn't really able to do it. But they have spent what money that they had in such a way as to not please almost any of their troops, which brings us to today and this week. What's going on at the moment is that Rachel Reeves spent so much, she was on course in March to miss her fiscal targets. She was on course to break her promise about the maximum amount that she would borrow. So she needed to scrabble around and at short notice get some money from somewhere. So she got $5 billion from the welfare budget. We've got ballooning entitlement payments in this country for all sorts of reasons, worklessness, disability, and all the rest of it. And she's gone after, in particular, the disability budget. And there's about £5 billion of cuts that quite a lot of that target the disability community. And the proposal of the government is that they take away some of the additional financial support for people who are in work as well as out of work, even if they have relatively severe conditions that previously would have got thousands of pounds in state support. An awful lot of Labour MPs have rebelled. In fact, phenomenal number of Labour MPs have rebelled. And they not just rebelled, by signing a letter in public. Right today, this morning, a letter was published by 108 MPs, Labour MPs, saying, kill the bill that enacts the reforms, right? Now, simple maths will tell you that's more than half of 165. And they have all put their names to this. And it's one thing to signal to your party whip, the party enforcers, that you might rebel against something. These guys, 108 of them have gone public. And in fact, it's now about 120. And even that doesn't count ministers who might resign and junior members of the government who might resign. So all of a sudden, this government, with an impregnable majority, has, is facing a vote next week where they could lose that welfare bill and the ability to score those savings, and do so because they have lost the discipline of a party, even though they had a majority. That is utterly sensational and incredibly difficult. And really, Keir Starmer is facing challenges in so many directions. All of a sudden, this is really kind of live politics playing out before our eyes today. If they abandon these attempts to save money, then you're going to have the markets already worrying about the debt pile, wondering what else the Labour Party has to say boo to, and Rachel Reeves gets out her chequebook. You've got the spectre of taxes very likely to go up in the autumn because they're going to need to balance the book somehow. And you've got a party that has over the last few days insisted, or leadership that's insisted, that these changes are right and the sensible thing to do, being utterly humiliated and the authority of the Prime Minister called into question. Some people are even talking about this being a confidence vote. You lose the premiership. That is not constitutionally the case, but there are some people saying that the Prime Minister's denied it. But we're in really, really, really essential territory because financial prudence, the promise of a sensible stewarding of the economy, was at the heart of what this government promised, and they're struggling to balance the books. And one of the key measures needed to do that is about to be thrown out with no plan of what to do next. And it actually feels quite perilous.
Having already, of course, I should just say we did also, as a Conservative government, we came in, inherit a debt pile and record deficits, blah, blah, blah. And we put record amounts of money into lots of things like the NHS. Anyway, I've done my defending just in case I ever want to come back to politics. But of course,
you also hated them all. So honestly, Andrew, you hate them all. You hate them. You can't go back because you kept telling me how much you hated them. So let's just forget the idea that you're ever going back. So don't you do your spin nonsense with me, because I can remember the last 15 years and I'm not letting you get away with it.
I did dislike an awful lot of my colleagues.
It's why I liked you.
So that's why we got on so well. But this is after, of course, Labour have also just gone backwards on just reversed the winter fuel allowance.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, this is incredible, like a year in and facing a rebellion. And this is, I have to say, Sam, if you don't follow Canadian politics, which I'm very surprised if you don't, but in Canada, the idea that members of Parliament rebel against the whip is almost unheard of. So the idea that 108 would put their name to a letter saying they're prepared to vote against it is just unheard of here. But
only one
I mean,
year
this
into
is
the mandate. That's the crazy part too. Like, it's such a short-lived honeymoon, if there was even one for Starmer.
So where does it end for Labour though? Because he can't keep doing these U-turns. U-turns cost you a lot in the minds of the public. Is there a chance that Keir Starmer isn't Labour leader? How high do you think the chance is that he isn't leader by the next election?
So that's two questions. The first one is, what does he do? I've been talking to government advisors today. Who knows? I genuinely struggle to know what the answer is here, right? I genuinely don't know, because they could buy themselves some time. There is a vote on this welfare bill next week. They could pause it, they could pull it, they could do it. You do wonder what the consequences of that would be. But it doesn't mean that they escape the essential question. 108/120 people who are publicly committed to voting against a change does mean that there is a very high chance of jeopardy, and just using the conventional arm twisting techniques to get people back on side, well, it's an awful lot of people that you've got to do. So it does feel strangely tricky. Keir Starmer's out of the country as well, right? He's at the NATO summit in The Hague, so he's not here dealing with it. He was at Cabinet this morning, but then flew to Amsterdam after that, and then on to The Hague in order to meet with world leaders, because there's a lot going on the world stage. So there isn't a steadying hand. It's unclear. That the sort of bigger problem with this government is a little bit that we sometimes struggle to quite work out where its center of gravity is, or where its kind of indeed, insistent direction is. And they need to set a direction, and then from there it could just things might flow. What's the bit that's going good? It's not an obvious answer to me.
It also speaks to their selection processes, right, and who actually got selected in these seats, because they pitched themselves very much as a Blairite light trist government to the electorate. But actually, it looks like a much greater percentage of their backbenchers come from the soft left, which has always existed in the Labour Party. But the soft left seems to be much greater numbers than perhaps people had understood. Is that fair?
I don't know. I'm nervous of past political terms like soft left and applying them across the vast swathes of the new Labour Party. A lot of them were elected in what we want to call red wall seats, seats that were historically Labour that turned blue under Boris Johnson, but now have gone back to the Labour Party. Quite a lot of those people are a bit more socially conservative. Indeed, quite a lot of the rebels that I have talked to, some of the most prominent ones, you really couldn't call, like, they're quite hard-edged reformers who just think that the disability element of this is wrong. Right? They think that scroungers should have every last penny taken away from them and think that there'll be great political gain to do so. This isn't just, it is as well, but it isn't just a sort of soppy soft left who just don't like doing anything difficult. These are people who are quite happily strip all sorts of groups from society from a lot of entitlements and would want to shout about it. That isn't the whole picture here. It's that they think this reform was rushed through to sort out a short-term problem from the Chancellor who's made too many mistakes, and that they're not against welfare reform, they're just against bad decisions that are going to make people who struggle and people who are quite evidently at the most difficult end of society make their lives not a bit worse. We're talking like 4 or 5 figures a year reduced from their entitlements. So a lot worse, and push them into poverty.
And on that question of, do we think, there's a lot of stuff written about this at the moment, what's the chances of Keir Starmer not leading the Labour Party at the next election? Is it realistic?
I mean, there is a chance. There is a chance. I can't foresee the course through the next few days. So ask me back in a week, and I'll attempt to answer that question then.
Okay, I want to get on to now. As long as we've still got time, Sam. But where are the Conservatives? Do you remember the Conservative Party?
Less than 1 in 5 people would vote for them at the moment. They're on 16% in the polls. Sometimes they do sometimes they do marginally better. Sometimes they do marginally worse. But all in, it's a party that limped out of power, utterly decimated. And I think generally there is not an appetite to particularly listen to them, even before, we get to the particular foibles of the current leadership, who not always, but sometimes struggle to make a mark and an impact, and seem to be taking their time in a very lackadaisical fashion, bring up a sort of punchier proposition for the country. It's fine to take your time in opposition, particularly when you're going to be out of power for a while. But I don't think you need policies to cut through, and they're not cutting through, and that's an issue.
I mean, you are right. Talented people such as myself did leave at the last election. I think those were your words. That's what I read them as. But but obviously the big challenge is obviously reform, right? And we've seen this before with the rise of UKIP, but not quite in the way we are at the moment. I think there was a poll this week had reform on 34%. What's your analysis then of how real this is? Because I sat down when I was back in the Commons a few weeks ago, and with a Labour colleague, current Labour colleague, former colleague, who said to me, I said, what's going to happen then? What do you think? What's your prediction for thing? And he said, Prime Minister Farage. And I was like, quite taken aback by that. I was like, are you like shitting me? Were my exact words? I said, is this really how you think this ends? And he said, oh yeah, I genuinely think there's a very high chance that that's where this ends. Whereas with Farage, people he has this ability to make a lot of noise, to do very well for what seems a short period of time. Then normally there's a personality fallout, yada, yada, yada. It never quite comes off. It never quite ends up where people predict it could have gone. But I was really struck by that. Someone saying, a Labour MP saying, Prime Minister Farage.
Right. Let's break that down into 2 bits. Could Nigel Farage become Prime Minister? And then let's just talk more generally about reform, right? There's an unresolved question at the moment, which is, what does the election in 2028, 2029 look like? What is the relationship between the Conservative Party and reform? Is there some kind of accommodation between the two, so they're not fighting each other like they did in the last general election to the cost of the Conservatives? Or, as the two basically pointing their cannons just at centre-left parties? And I don't know the answer to that, although it seems inconceivable, that it seems hard to imagine. I've had it. A lot of people think that Kemi Badenoch won't survive. Most options to replace her are going to be more sympathetic to reform and some kind of arrangement. So it's far from impossible that reform and the Tories combine in some way, in which case the party with the bigger polling clout would put is reform, and that could lead to Prime Minister Nigel Farage, or the party historically with larger MPs and a history to it is the Conservative Party. And so there is a path to Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister. But yes, they are absolutely riding the crest of the wave at the moment. But there are some structural things that are well worth pointing out. The first is they're not quite a one-man band, but it's sometimes not a great deal more. If it was Richard Tice leading Reform Party, where would they be in the polls? I'm not sure, but I'm not sure it would be as high. Is there a cohesive band of people around him? Well, there was a bust-up a couple of weeks ago that saw the chairman left, first demoted, then left, then brought back in a different position. And they brought in the new chairman who didn't say no to the question on Good Morning Britain, do you believe in ghosts? And so there are all sorts of kind of small squalls around that. Do you look at Reform UK and think that they've either got an economic proposition that the country could vote for and a cabinet in the waiting? I sort of think, no, it's quite hard to see that at the moment. So there's an awfully long journey, despite the fact that they're fashionable at the moment. So, do we are they the kind of, do they have multiple identities? Is Nigel Farage, trying to signal a closeness with some of the industrial heartlands in the country, promising to reopen some of the pits, trying to stand with and potentially stand for steelworkers up in your old part of the woods, Scunthorpe near your old constituency. All of that thing at the time where the voter base for reform is Thatcherite, right? These are people who were Conservatives or UKIP who went Boris in 2019 and scattered the winds in 2024, right? These are people on the centre right. So the more you go centre left in order to pick up a bigger, broader base of voters, the more you struggle with your traditional voters. So there's all sorts of tensions there, and there's a long way to the next elections. Maybe the Conservative Party are the vehicle upon which Nigel Farage can ride to take him to Downing Street, but also maybe fashions change and reform aren't quite the cohesive thing that they seem after local elections, where in a protest vote they're put into 10 different council leadership positions. Let's see how that goes. Into a number of mayoralties. Let's see how that goes. And having to deal with their own teething troubles as a political party. Let's see how that goes. And no, I don't think Nigel Farage believes in ghosts.
Good. And they have been mopping up left wing. They have been mopping up left wing votes as well, though, of course, because look how well they did in County Durham, in Doncaster, in the recent election. So, their appeal is not just Thatcherite, centre right voters. And you've had this whole pitch of them on welfare, almost out lefting Labour on welfare as well.
But I'm asking, how cohesive is that actually amongst those who are running the party? I totally get that there are people who are frustrated with the two main parties. But in the end, to what extent does Richard Tice lean towards somebody who wants to endorse public spending and state subsidy in order to support some of the historic industries? To what extent does the party faithful and the base reflect a broad base of the British public, even if they can get votes from the left as well as the right?
Yeah, and if there is a change of leadership, I wasn't a particular fan of the current Conservative leader.
I thought you were going to say you weren't going to throw your hat in the ring.
No, it's only if the call
the
comes.
Nation mourns. I thought you were going to be on the first plane back, and then, Percy, the teacher, to put the country in detention.
Our local champions. But anyway, you must have other things to do, so I don't want to keep you much longer. But just one last thing, which I did talk about with you on WhatsApp then. Assisted dying and now decriminalised abortion. Nobody promised this at the election, but the UK Parliament doesn't seem to be able to agree on lots of other things at the moment, but has managed to agree on both of these things.
I've just got one note for Joseph before I answer that question, which is, no, we didn't talk about it. I told Andrew to ask this question of me, which he has done quite effectively, but it was not a discussion. So there are two things there. All of a sudden, that this government is quite likely to deliver that weren't in the manifesto that could make a pretty substantial difference to people's lives. Now, we have had the endorsement by the Commons of an assisted dying bill. Now, this, and obviously you've got your own experience in Canada, highly contentious, is a majority backed by the public, a narrow majority backed in the House of Commons, but not interestingly backed by, for instance, the health secretary that would have to be involved in the delivery of the service, partly because of the financial and practical implications that it would have. But it is taking the country on a journey that it didn't vote for, and it's going to have that, and involves a fundamental change in the relationship between the state and individuals and the health service, which plays a very special part in the UK, and individuals. And I think that's fraught with danger. I think people in number 10 think it's fraught with danger. They sort of signed up to encouraging it to happen via this private member's bill process, which is a non-government legislative process. So they don't own it, but they're going to have to do it if it passes, and that's uncomfortable as well. So they only control some of the direction of this, not as much as you normally would. Certainly not as much as you normally would something as massive as this. And you don't really kind of know how it is going to land in practice if it's implemented. And then there are some contentious changes around abortion, which were voted through fairly comfortably last week in order to decriminalise abortion. And the implications of those are, again, being disputed by different parties. And it is strongly denied that it could result in a high number of late-term abortions. This is complex legislation still going through Parliament, so let's see where it comes out in the wash. But it's going to be an ugly element of an argument in the next election campaign, I foresee, from social conservative opponents who think that we're ended up with the biggest changes that this government does were not ones in the manifesto, not ones that people necessarily voted for, but might flip to be unpopular, but carried by a majority of MPs who didn't stand with a mandate for that.
Interesting. Cracking. I guess we've taken more of your time than you expected.
Do you want to get rid of me?
No.
I'll keep being rude.
You look like you were about to leave. I don't know whether Joseph has any other issues. I could talk all day, Sam. I actually quite enjoy talking to Sam. I used to enjoy talking to Sam more when he was buying the drinks, however.
Yeah, right. Well,
it's true fact. Sam.
What we should do is we've covered some good ground. We can have Sam back and maybe in the future for a deeper dive on some of these other things.
There we go.
I would love that. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
The most important question though, Sam, is how much are you missing me?
I'm missing you enormously, Andrew, to the extent, but not quite enough to stop when you passed me on the stairs the other day because I was very busy.
Yes, you did say we must catch up as you walked on, which is what, there's nothing so right as an ex-MP. It's like, lovely to see you. We must chat sometime. Not now though, however, because I'm far too busy chasing after actual MPs. The stuff I used to leak to you, the briefings I used to give you. I mean, none of that obviously happened, but I thought like a little bit more time.
Yeah, we've lost Joseph.
Joseph's on a really bad signal, and also
he's fed up with you. He's lost faith.
He was on Hertel internet, but anyway, that's cracking, Sam. Really do appreciate it.
A pleasure. I'd love to
and
do it
we'll
again.
catch up when I'm next back.